Alright, so we are going to continue talking about the cardiac cycle in this video. So the cardiac cycle is the atria and ventricles going through their contraction and relaxation states. So anytime there is contraction of the heart muscle, that is called systole, and anytime there's relaxation, it is diastole. And this is where we get systolic and diastolic blood pressure readings from. So this is a very carefully regulated process because we really need to make sure that we're not trying to contract like an atria and a ventricle at the exact same time, because that's going to make it really hard to get blood to flow from the atria into the ventricles without flowing backwards. So in cardiac diastole, all of the chambers of the heart are relaxed. This allows blood to actually flow into the heart, into those atria, from either the lungs or from the rest of the body. And then we do atrial systole, so we get the atria to contract, pushing blood flow into the ventricles, which are still in diastole. They are still in that relaxed state. And then we kind of flip-flop, and the atria go into diastole, they relax, and ventricles go into systole and contract to pump blood out to the lungs or to the rest of the body, depending on which chamber we're looking at being contracted. So, this is going to move that blood through the heart. Again, the heart is a muscle and it functions as a pump. It is pumping blood through the body into those different circulation patterns, pulmonary and systemic. And so if you can imagine what would happen if the atria and ventricles contracted at the same time here. So if the atria contract, trying to force blood there, and at the same time the ventricles contracting, it's going to try to force some of that blood back into the atria. Some of it will go out the pulmonary trunk like it's supposed to, but that can make it really, really hard. And so one of the reasons that it's going to stay relaxed here is to allow that blood flow to come in all the way, and that also kind of creates some pressure to help pull that blood through this particular valve into that ventricle so that then it can be pumped out of that ventricle. So let's look at some of the heart valves now. And so we have 4 heart valves, the 2 atrioventricular valves. These are going to be the valves in between the atria and ventricles, and there's going to be the mitral or bicuspid valve between the left atria and left ventricle, and then the tricuspid valve between the right atria and right ventricle. And then we also have the 2 semilunar valves. We have the aortic valve in between the left ventricle and aorta, and then the pulmonary valve, which is in between the right ventricle and pulmonary trunk, to help control that blood flow and make sure that it's not leaving prematurely or flowing backwards back into those chambers of the heart. So this is a transverse section of the heart, cutting at the atria, so that we can actually see this view of the valves. And so over here on the right-hand side of the heart, we can see the tricuspid valve. Tri means 3, and then you can see each of these little cusps of those valves. And so the tricuspid valve, or right atrioventricular valve is another name for it, is again going to be between the right atria and right ventricle. And then over here on the left hand side of the heart we have the bicuspid or mitral valve, only has those 2 cusps. Again, this can also be referred to as the left atrioventricular valve. And this image right here is showing them in their closed state, and so the main reason that there's this little bit of a gap is to indicate the different cusps. These close pretty tightly in reality. And then over here, we've got the aortic valve and pulmonary valve. You can also add semilunar into that name, so aortic semilunar valve and pulmonary semilunar valve are alternative names for those. They do have the 3 cusps, but as you can see, they're much, much smaller than the atrioventricular valves are, because they are going to be positioned at the base of those vessels rather than in between the chambers of the heart, and so they don't need to be quite as big. when those valves open up, this is what those atrioventricular valves are going to look like opened up. So the tendons and muscles are going to pull on those cusps and open them up so the blood can actually flow from the atria into the ventricles. And we still see those semilunar valves being closed here. This is a sagittal cross-section image down here. Still have those semilunar valves closed, but now we have the mitral or bicuspid valve over here is open. And so again, those tendons are just going to help pull on those valves and go ahead and keep them in place so that they don't flip back up into the atria, and to actually help open them when blood flow needs to move through the chambers. On the flip side, here is the semilunar valves open to allow that blood flow out through the valves. Now we've got the atrioventricular valves closed. Same idea over here. Those cusps in this case are going to flip up instead of down for those valves. Basically, the cusps will open in the same direction that blood is going to flow through. So it's going to press through that way, which means that those flaps are going to open in that same direction. Here we see an echocardiogram. This is basically an ultrasound of the heart. And we are looking at valve movement here. So up here in this panel, you can see these are going to be the atrioventricular valves right here. Those cusps are opening and closing. Same idea down here. Those valves are opening and closing, and we can see again this transverse section right here in this particular panel as those keep kind of going back and forth. So we can see the two atrioventricular valves, and then this is most likely the aortic valve right there. Or no, probably pulmonary valve actually. And so we can see those valves opening and closing. Pretty cool. All right, let's talk about heart sounds and how they are made by these different parts of the cardiac cycle. So the valves opening and closing is what causes the sound of the heart. And so heart sounds are frequently referred to as a lub-dub sound. This is going to be, again, from those valves opening and closing. So here in that lub phase, we have the atrioventricular valves, the AV valves are closing, semilunar valves going to open, so aortic pressure is going to start increasing at that point in time. Ventricular pressure is increasing a lot, atrial pressure is really, really low, and so that's going to be that first sound, and then that dub is coming from the semilunar valves closing and the atrioventricular valves opening. All right, so the closing and opening of those valves is creating those lub-dub sounds. And so this is just because the snapping open of those valves or snapping closed is going to create that sound, as well as the movement of the blood through those valves at that particular point in time. But those actual like beats of the heart are from valves opening and closing. The blood flow is going to sound a little bit different, but can still be detected. All right, so it's pretty cool, I think. So there is sometimes a third heart sound indicated over here on this graph. This is rarely heard in healthy individuals. This can be the sound of blood flowing backwards into the atria, or it's kind of sloshing back and forth in the ventricle. So this is sometimes heard in younger individuals, so children, certain athletes, and pregnant women. Later in life, if none of these things are happening, it can sometimes indicate congestive heart failure and need further testing. And so this sound is going to come again from basically the valves not opening and closing at the same time when they're supposed to. So that blood flow is kind of thrown off because the valves aren't opening and closing in the pattern that they are supposed to. There can be a fourth heart sound coming in when there is failure of the left ventricle, so that is not great, but those are, again, pretty rare. So heart murmur is used to describe any sort of unusual sound coming from the heart caused by basically a turbulent flow of blood, so blood that is flowing in directions it's not supposed to be. They're graded on scales of 1 to 6, with 1 being the most benign and least problematic, 6 being very, very severe. And so that is going to indicate further testing is needed to see if there's some sort of valve prolapse. Mitral valve prolapse is relatively common, and usually in most people it's going to be pretty benign and not need a whole lot of care, but there are certain precautions that need to be taken with stuff like that. So this is showing where to place stethoscopes for auscultation, so hearing those heart sounds. And as you can see, we've got this color coordinated, and so each of those placements of the stethoscope is going to be associated with one of those particular valves that allows you to hear the opening and closing of that valve best. So down here for the tricuspid valve, mitral valve over here, pulmonary valve, and the aortic valve. And so that's just, again, being able to place that stethoscope in a position that is going to best allow you to hear the opening and closing of that particular valve. And so things can sound a little bit different based on where you place that stethoscope, and that can indicate problems with a particular valve that might warrant further testing. We will continue talking about cardiac muscle and the electrical activity of the heart in the next video.